So a little bit more about myself and why I'm here. I specialize in child trauma, so that's abuse and neglect mainly, and in attachment. And that has led me to the Dartmouth Trauma Interventions Research Center at Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Hitchcock. So I was a intern. West Central used to host interns in 2008. So I was a West Central Behavioral Health intern with Dartmouth and postdoc with Dartmouth and the National Center for PTSD, which is at the VA. And I just came over to Dartmouth full-time in 2013. I did stay with West Central, and I still carry a small caseload in the River Mill Child Clinic right across the street. So I still worked for Sue Ellen and was definitely echoing everything she said. And I've actually learned more from those clinical experiences than in any book I could ever read or any video or any training I could ever go to. So most of what I talk about comes from a lot of that, 10, 12 years of experience. Okay, go ahead. So I know you all mostly employ adults, but I'm going to talk a lot about what happens when we are adults and the choices we make and the behaviors we have that are related to what happened to us when we were kids. Okay, go ahead. All right, so has anybody heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands. Oh, lots of people. Okay. I like to be really interactive, so can anybody give me the punchline and describe it? Describe the findings? Yeah.
What happens to you as a child affects your health outcomes as an adult.
Excellent. Anybody else have anything to add from that study that they remember the punchline?
The effects are measurable.
Yeah. Good.
They actually go through generations.
Yeah, they go through generations, right? We'll talk a little bit about that. So in essence, a large HMO in California wanted to study obesity in their insured population. So these are privately insured adults. So these folks already have some privilege, right? That they have jobs and they have health insurance. And they were trying to do a weight reduction program to reduce their health care costs. And they started looking at the data and realized that certain people had a really, really hard time losing weight. And they embedded a survey about childhood experiences. And when they ran their statistics, they realized that people with problematic health in later life, and as well as people who had trouble losing weight, had a lot more adversity during their childhood. And so they went back into the data set of over 10,000 adults and looked a little bit more carefully. So next one. Privately insured, 10,000 adults. Almost half had graduated from college. So again, this is a privileged sample. And they then wanted to look at these childhood adversities, which I'm going to show you in a second, and their link with health risk behaviors like smoking and substance use and unprotected sex, etc., and how that related to diseases and illnesses later in life. Okay, so this is voluntary, interactive, silent poll. So don't raise your hands and don't tell me your answers, and you don't even have to do it if you think it might be triggering. This is going to be asking questions for you to reflect, if you want, on your own childhood and the adversities you might have had. So this is abuse, neglect, parental substance use disorders, etc. Okay? So if you want to, keep your silent count as we go through. These are the ACE questions. Okay. And that font changed, sorry. It used to be a lot bigger. Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, humiliate you, act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? Number 1. Number 2, did a parent or other adult often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you or hit you hard so that you were injured? Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way or attempt or actually have oral, anal, vaginal intercourse with you? Next. You guys can read this on your own probably. Okay. Number 6, in case you can't read it, were your parents separated or divorced? Number 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, hit with something hard, repeatedly hit over a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or knife? Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problematic drinker or used street drugs? And go ahead and do number 9 and 10. So the number of yes answers is your ACE score, and many of us have at least one ACE. That's part of the human experience, sadly, but some of us don't. And in aggregate, when researchers look at like the average number of ACEs that a community has or a person has, when we average those all together, they predict specific things about us. But there are a lot of outliers who don't fit this mold, so it's not a damning or deterministic number necessarily. And some people who I love and care for very much have very high ACE scores. And there are lots of stories of people who have high ACE scores and do fine. Lots of stories of people who have 0 ACEs and do horribly, right? It's not a deterministic number. But what we find is it predicts a lot of things, and the researchers were shocked. So go ahead. So about half the adults had at least one adversity, which again is normal for the human experience. About a quarter had 2 or more. And what they found was that there was a graded relationship between the number of ACEs that you have as a child, your risky behaviors, and your disease state. So basically, every single slope, if you think of like the x-axis is your ACE score and the y-axis is your disease, every single slope looked like this. So the more ACEs you had, the more diseases you had. And this is for in 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds. So those questions I just asked you have nothing to do with your physical health, right? When you're 2, when you're 6. They have to do with how you were treated and your environment and how you were socialized and if you were neglected or cared for and if people were kind to you or mean to you. And yet they found 50 years later that that stuff predicts disease. Yeah, Jane?
The definition of disease is substance disorder as well?
Yeah, mental health and health disease, including substance use, right? Because that's the big one, right? So that's kind of an obvious link, right? Is when we are treated poorly and we have pain and suffering, what do we do to make ourselves feel better? Once we have access to it, once we're teens or young adults. Self-medicate. We smoke pot, we drink, whatever we can get our hands on to try to either sort of numb the pain or get like a little bit of a high to feel good or fit in with a crowd or something to that effect, right? So that one kind of makes sense. What else do we do that can be risky and unhealthy? Eat to cope. Yep.
Find inappropriate partners.
Yep. Unprotected sex, right? STDs, get into unhealthy relationships, right? And so those are kind of like no-brainers. Everybody now pretty much gets that, right? But what they didn't expect was that it predicted cancer, predicted cardiovascular disease, it predicted inflammatory diseases, it predicted diabetes, and the researchers actually took this data to the MDs in their academic centers, to their orthopedic surgeons, all these top-notch MDs, and they didn't believe them. They said, go back and rerun it. We don't believe you. Because they don't ever talk about this. They weren't ever talking about this in their clinics. And so, like it's as if we're sort of admitting that we've been doing medicine wrong our whole, the whole time we've had medicine. And so they made them rerun the numbers. And if you hear these researchers talk about it, they did. And when it kept coming out this way, one of the researchers talks about how he just wept. He just wept because he had no idea. He had no idea that this many children are treated this way. And he had no idea that it was going to have such an impact on physical health. And he says some of the medical community still did not believe them until they ran a prospective study, which means you start the data collection in childhood and you watch them for 50 years instead of a retrospective study. Okay, so here are some odds ratios. If you have 4 or more ACEs, in aggregate, not you specifically, but on average, compared to someone who has 0, you have 1.5 times the risk of being obese, 2 to 4 times the risk of smoking and having more than 50 sexual partners, getting STDs, 4 to 12 times the risk of abusing alcohol or drugs, having depression, or committing a suicide attempt. Any questions or thoughts about this? Is this surprising to anybody? And what, if anybody is medically trained, what are the mechanisms here that get us from, obesity makes some sense. Somewhere in these risks, we also see inflammatory problems, cancer, diabetes. Does anybody know sort of the mechanisms of how we get there? Yeah.
I study this some. Part of it has to do with neural pathway rerouting, but some of it also has to do with allostatic load, like the cumulative effects of ongoing stresses have a physiological effect on our bodies, which then has that increases inflammation and makes us more susceptible to disease. And
that's exactly right. So stress and toxic stress, and she used the word allostatic load. You've heard of cortisol, right? Is the stress hormone. Cortisol, if we have too much of it, puts on weight and I'm not medically trained, but it has these other ill effects to our physical health. So we need a little bit of cortisol, and we're supposed to spike, like if we have a test or we have a meeting with our boss or, wedding day, like you're supposed to get anxious. You're supposed to have some cortisol and some adrenaline and noradrenaline to get you going and get you excited for the day and prepared. But if you have constant toxic stress, like some children do, eventually it does a lot of harm to your body. And we'll have some more slides on that. I also saw huge disparities in those who are vulnerable to more social structure vulnerabilities, as in racial and ethnic minorities were more vulnerable to high ACEs. LGBTQ communities, low education, low income, and unemployed people, or those who are unable to work, were a lot more vulnerable to ACEs during childhood because of the structures in our society, in our institutions, in our community that still bring isms, right? Racism, homophobia, all these isms, classism, to these people. So Folletti is the main researcher, and their hallmark study that first published the results of these 10,000 adults quoted this: childhood exposure should be recognized as the basic causes of morbidity and mortality in adult life. So most of us don't think that way. Most of us don't think that childhood trauma and toxic stress, a little bit of stress is fine. Toxic stress is the #1 cause of morbidity and mortality. But now you all are going to leave this training, and you're going to know that. And piggybacking on what Sue Ellen said, all the more reason why we need more resources in mental health, social structures, social safety nets, to mitigate the effects of trauma or prevent trauma in our society, because guess what's driving our healthcare costs? This. Yes.
Will you go a little further into what makes stress toxic? What am I at?
Yeah. If you have no ability to cope. So when you're very little, you don't have any ability to cope, so you rely on your parents, right? So when you're a baby or a toddler, you need to get your shots. You need to fall down and get hurt. Like, these bad things need to happen to you. That's part of life. But if a major bad thing happens to you, like one of those questions, you need to have loving people who are attuned to you and can comfort you and can try to fix the problem that is causing all the stress. So if you have 1 or 2 of these bad things happen to you, but you have loving people who, for the most part, do a pretty good job and protect you from ongoing trauma and make you feel better and help you calm, then you might not have toxic stress, right? Your body can like go back to baseline. But if these things just keep happening over and over and over, even the most loving family or preschool teacher is not going to be able to prevent all this toxic stress. So repeated events is going to make it very hard to reduce that toxic stress. Yeah.
ACES is all about childhood trauma, but I just want to ask you as a clinician if there is some research to support extrapolating this idea out, like folks who are in poverty, particularly folks of color, particularly LGBTQ folks of color, say, are going to be exposed to repeated toxic stress
Yes.
throughout their whole lives. So
Right.
I just want to, because it's easy if we're talking about childhood trauma to be like, well,
Right.
we just need to help children. But is it possible to extrapolate that that kind of toxic stress is having these negative health outcomes,
Yes.
is increasing negative health outcomes for certain populations?
Yes, absolutely. So
across life?
our vulnerable period, our sensitive period is during childhood, right? So these things kind of have their biggest impact on childhood, but absolutely, even if you had a great childhood and then say you move, right? That's why it can be really hard for immigrants and refugees, either direction, I guess, but you move into a new environment that's racist or blah, 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 blah. That toxic stress can absolutely build up later in life as well, yeah.
So all of these questions address home life. What about schools? I mean, kids spend a
Yeah.
lot of time in school and bullying and everything else.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but no questions about.
Yeah, about peers, right? Well, I mean, they did this in 1996, so we didn't have a dialogue, as much of a dialogue about bullying back then when they first did this study. And now there's a lot more discourse about it and a lot more attention being drawn to it. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. Peer and community, they also didn't have a lot of community violence, right, in question. It's really like, that was really about home. And when you're young, home is most important, but obviously the peers and the community are going to have a big impact as well. Yeah.
I have a question. Say you have your ACES or ACES or whatever, and then for a short period of time, and then a lifestyle change or a family change or an
Yeah.
environmental change, and you maybe have counseling or
Yeah.
treatment or people working towards making things better.
Yeah.
Is there a way to like change the course of
Yeah.
your health or reverse what could have possibly
Yeah.
happened?
Lots of protective factors will set you on a healthier path, right? So lots of resilience factors like loving people around you, good education, intelligence is a big protective factor, having an adult who can care and protect you. Actually, attractiveness is a protective factor, all these things that are just known across every psychological dimension, that's a protective factor. And of course, we try really hard in counseling to help people, but it's a long road for some people who have had a life, a childhood full of adversity. It can be a hard road sometimes. Sometimes it's not.
So what do you think the difference is between someone who's had a horrible childhood
Yeah.
and grows up to not necessarily not have any issues, but let's just say
Yeah.
has made them a stronger person and may be able to handle things that
Yeah.
adverse things that come their way versus the person who
Yeah, but
grows up and can't.
right, so the number one protective factor is having a loving, protective adult that helps you get through all of it and cares for you and nurtures you. But aside from that, the big protective factors are intelligence and attractiveness. It's just odd.
Physical attractiveness, is that what you mean?
What?
Physical attractiveness?
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, it helps you get further in this world.
I mean, teachers talk more to cute kids. I mean, it's just pervasive across every psychological phenomenon. And let's see, what else? Oh, being in pro-social activities. So, lots of these kids don't want to join sports and go into groups and clubs, but that's another protective factor, is if they can get involved, or as adults, being in social activities. But sometimes it's just a who knows. Sometimes it's just a who knows. Okay. So hopefully I have convinced you now, if you didn't already know, that resilient children are made. They're not born resilient. We are made resilient through our interactions with our caregivers, in essence. We used to think very differently about that. And you can remember and recall what we've learned from orphanages, right, in other countries in Eastern Europe, where the mindset used to be, don't hold them, don't cradle them, don't touch them, don't attach to them, because it won't be good for them, basically. They also obviously didn't have the resources to get around to all these kids, but we used to just think like babies won't remember it, they'll bounce back, kids will bounce back, right? But we've actually found the opposite. Now again, they need adversity. Like, children need adversity. It's fine if they break their leg. It's fine if they have problems, right? Like, we need to build grit. But too much, we now know, is the exact opposite. They're going to be made weaker with too much adversity. They're not going to be made stronger. They're not born inherently resilient. They're taught that, and they're shaped through their environment. Okay, let's show a video. Thank you, Rob, for...
For sure, it's a little bit smoother, but we'll get there.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So if my experiences are often around people who yell, scream, let's see, you're my caregiver, give me mean looks, swear, you name it, right? If that's my experience growing up, then what connections am I hardwiring in?
Adults are not there for you or not kind to people.
Adults, danger, not meet my needs, get through this world alone. So then I go, what's that?
Can't trust.
Can't trust. So then I go out to work for you all as my employer, and what do my connections say? Danger, out to get me, doesn't have my best interest in mind, can't trust, right? Whereas if my experiences were, like, you don't have to be a perfect mom, but for the most part, you smile at me and you coo, and you, as I'm growing up, you're for the most part supportive and, talk nice to me, make me feel good about myself. Then I go to you as my employer. I see a neutral face, so she's got a neutral face right now. I think my brain says human, kind, has my best interest, right? So the hostile attribution bias is when I look at a neutral face and I see anger, gonna hurt me, danger. So people who have more adversity in their life will look at the same face on a computer screen. And the people with lots of adversity will say, danger, fight. People with less adversity will see a neutral face and say, she's all right. Maybe I'll approach her. Yeah.
Talk about the impact of depression and then
Yeah.
comes from that, because that's not, it doesn't, to most people's mind, that doesn't come across as adversity, but the impact on a child.
Right.
is profound.
So a depressed caregiver just won't be as attuned to a child, right? So most of us, I'll pick on somebody else, most of us, if we're healthy, and postpartum depression is very real, and we should not be blaming anybody for it, right? And if you are a healthy caregiver, when the baby goes, you go, and when the baby goes, you go, right? So she's like mimicking my face, so that's a building block of empathy. Now you're a depressed mom, so you don't do anything. And I go, right? So she's not mirroring me, and she's not empathizing with me, and she can't as easily attune to my needs. And so I do not build those building blocks for emotional development and social development, because there's no dance between us, right? So hundreds of years ago, that was fine, because if you had postpartum, you'd be my auntie and you'd step in. And if you broke your leg, you'd be my grandma and you'd step in. And if you died, you'd be my older sister. And you know what I mean? So there'd be this village that if one died or one got hurt or one had schizophrenia, like the other people step in and meet my needs. But now we all live in our own little homes with no help. You know, move away from our villages. I don't know why I ever did that, 'cause it's very hard. And so we don't have that same social net that we used to.
Just want to shout out dads in this equation too.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, they can play the same role. They don't get quite the same oxytocin, that bonding hormone. They do more of a top-down process, but they still work. Yeah.
So I'm thinking, in the first 25 years of my life, I just assumed that everybody's family life was exactly like mine, and I was fortunate. Then when I started teaching school and had interaction with parents as parent-teacher conferences and others, I began to see how some parents were tremendously talented and caring, and some kids were really less fortunate, and some parents you couldn't get to come in.
Right.
And I began to see how I was probably wrong in my assumptions when I was growing up that all my classmates had a similar
Yeah.
family life to mine, because parents have different skills. And now that I've lived many years, I realize that, you know, some people are less fortunate and some people are really much more fortunate. But I'm wondering if less fortunate kids who live in homes that are not healthy can't be educated to realize that there are possibilities, so that they don't assume that everybody lives that way and they choose partners that treat them that way because that's the way, you know, like I thought,
Yeah.
that's the way life is,
Yeah.
to break that cycle.
Right. So those brain connections are wired in through experiences. It's very hard to tell someone it can be different. What changes the networks are experiences that it can be different. So you might have like awesome teachers, right, throughout your middle childhood that show you it can be different, that build those good feelings, that change your look at a neutral face, right? But you can't, really very, very hard to tell someone to think differently, right? And because it's been kind of somewhat wired in, and I associate a human with making me feel bad about myself. When I go to pick a partner in life, Sarah, if you're nice to me and you say kind things and you make me feel good, it's not familiar, it doesn't fit, I move on. And I go to you, and you put me down and control me. Ah, that's familiar, this is where I belong. We're going to make a baby. So that's how the generation continues. Now, it's very hard to tell, and this is what I do for work, right? It's very hard to tell that teenager, like, don't hook up with that girl. Don't hook up with that boy. Like, it's not going to be healthy. They don't. It's what fits. And so they need experiences. I mean, you can tell them over and over and over. It takes a lot longer.
There are these wonderful stories of kids who like eat by themselves in the school cafeteria because
Yeah.
they're new and they don't have any friends, and these groups of other kids that go and purposefully sit
Yeah,
at a table with someone or someone out
Yeah.
on the playground who's by
Yeah.
themselves.
absolutely.
Yep.
Or buddy
That-
benches.
Cannot do that kind of.
Yeah, yeah, and kids who are single kids. What am I trying to say? Only children. Thank you. Who are abused and neglected have worse outcomes than if you had siblings, because you can socialize with your siblings a little and take care of each other a little.
There's probably no exact number, but I'm curious. So I work with a wonderful gentleman who, he and his wife foster children. And I was having a conversation with him at work one day about this, and he said, you know, in his experience, if he takes in a child who's been in an environment for 3 years that was like that, then it takes 3
3
years
years.
for them to come out of that by experience.
Yeah.
And that was just like amazing to me. So the
Yeah.
longer that they're in it, the longer positive experience even coming forward, it takes them to come out of it.
You just stole my line. That's what I tell foster parents all the time. I'm like, how long were they in an unhealthy environment? 6 years. Okay, well, it's probably going to take about 6 years to reshape those expectations and how you relate to humans. Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about the dads? So if
Their role?
about moms, but if we have like a single dad doing
Oh, yeah.
all the work, can you talk more about that?
Same things apply. I mean, the amount of stress that the dad has, the amount of attunement that the dad can have, same thing, same concepts apply. The only difference is they don't have the same innate bonding hormones, so they don't have the oxytocin, which is like, who cares, right? If we have C-sections, we don't get the same oxytocin, so.
So that doesn't affect those protective factors being like,
If we have C-sections, we don't get as much oxytocin when we birth. Yeah.
So that would be the same for adopted foster
Yeah.
children, is it?
Yeah. Ask your question one more time.
so I'm just wondering, does that affect the level of protective factors that the dad can have on influencing that child's trauma that they may be having?
Probably not. Probably not. I imagine it's the same. I'm not sure everybody's ever asked that research question. I think they can have just as much influence in the long run. Yeah.
It's interesting. I grew up in an alcoholic family that was not physically abusive, but intensely mentally cruel
Right.
between my father and mother. And I know now, in retrospect, that in both of their cases, it was directly tied to their experiences in World War II.
Interesting, yeah.
Where my mother had to escape from Eastern Europe as a young kid, and my father was in the Pacific and probably had to kill people
Right.
and stuff. Those experiences kind of broke both of them,
Right.
and they couldn't help but bring that to us inadvertently.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so that's something I didn't see reflected in this.
Right.
Sort of these larger events that take place.
Right.
Like
Or the depression.
9/11. Someone was talking about
Yeah.
responding to 9/11 and what that must have done
Yeah.
to those families.
Absolutely. Or the Great Depression, or any kind of war, adult traumas, community traumas, historical traumas. Yeah. I mean, it all counts. I'm just a kid person. So I focus a lot on what happens during kids, because it's our period of most rapid brain development, 0 to 3 or 0 to 5. So a lot of things are forming those first few years. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving pretty quickly. So basically, when the stress response system is triggered too often, we can do a couple different things. We can overreact to stress because we're sensitized to it, or we can desensitize to it and numb out. And neither of those are great for us. To be the one, well, do you want to keep going? So this is a figure of all the different areas of our body in our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system that are affected by too much stress. So it's not just like the heart rate, right? It's like our pupils, our digestive system, glucose secretions, like you name it. It's affected by toxic stress. Hence why all these diseases are affected, right? So this is the sensitized response. I bark at everything. I can't go wrong that way. They're reacting to everything. And this is the desensitized response. We're numbed out to everything, right? We just kind of shut off and numb out. And we can go back and forth as humans. And it's adaptive in the moment to do those things, but obviously it's not adaptive over the course of your life to keep numbing out or overreacting. And it can cause, toxic stress can cause damage to all areas of the brain. So the younger you are, the more widespread the problems, because our brain is developing so quickly. Whereas the older you are when trauma happens, it looks more typical of what we call PTSD, because we derived PTSD on war veterans. That's where we came up with their diagnosis. I'm going to keep moving because I'm running out of time. This is just a graph of cortisol. It's called diurnal cortisol patterns. We're supposed to spike. The green line is healthy. We're supposed to spike cortisol in the morning and come down to almost zero by the time we go to bed so we can sleep. The orange line is a group of kids who were maltreated but are now in a foster home, so it's blunted a little bit. They don't get the get up and go that they quite need in the morning, and they don't get down to zero. The purple line are maltreated kids still in chaos. So you can imagine that, if you have a childhood or a lifetime of chaotic stress, my employer wants me to be there at 8 a.m., but I don't get that boost in cortisol to get me up and get moving, so I'm late. And then I don't come down to zero to be able to sleep. So it's this vicious cycle of really poor sleep because they can't come down, and then energy drinks in the morning, right, to get them going because they have these biological effects of toxic stress. They also found that they videotaped toddlers with their caregivers during a finger prick because they were doing tests, lab tests on different metrics, and they found that they coded the amount of nurturance that the caregiver gave to the child when they got their finger pricked. Because most kids are like, ah, right? 2 or 3-year-olds, it's not pleasant. And the more nurturing the caregiver was, predicted the healthier slope. And the more the caregiver was like, toughen up. I mean, there is a time to tell your kids to toughen up, but it's not when you're 3, right? So the more they were insensitive, the flatter the slope. Okay. I'm going to skip this one because I think I've talked about it enough. I just kind of gave the punchline, but basically the effects of trauma differ depending on when it starts. You can do the first one. So babies and toddlers have generalized, coordination, all these developmental milestones, language, all these things that can be affected by too much stress because that brain's developing. So lots of anxiety that can persist. Middle childhood will have, if trauma starts then, they'll have more specific fears that are related to what's happened to them, and a lot of avoidance because it's our latent period where we go in and we avoid everything in our emotional lives. One more. And then, older children and adults will have more complex emotional responses, but more narrow and specific symptoms that look more like PTSD. Okay. Obviously, these are going to have major impacts on work productivity, school performance. So if we have trauma in our histories, we have lower GPAs, more absences, more behavior problems. A lot of effects on executive functioning, so memory and concentration, because we spend a lot of our time, if we have a lot of trauma and stress, we spend a lot of time in our more primitive brain trying to survive, and we spend a lot less time in our prefrontal cortex, which is where we plan, pay attention, solve problems, because we're constantly barking at all of the potential threats that are coming our way, even if they're not real threats, right? So we haven't developed the executive functioning as well, so we'll have worse attention, worse concentration, worse memories, worse problem solving. Lots of times we'll see poor frustration tolerance and easily overwhelmed. And can anybody put that link together? Or why that would be?
Well, just going back to the whole idea that you don't have a resilience to plow through.
Right.
And to focus. And I'm imagine that your brain or your there are different neural pathways go immediately to
Danger,
you know,
yeah. Ah! Right. And so nobody's ever well, you haven't been comforted enough, right? So when we comfort children, that's how they learn how to regulate. And then eventually they can start regulating on their own and comforting themselves. But it all starts with those first processes of learning how to regulate by someone regulating you. So if you didn't have that, you can't regulate your overwhelm, and you stay high for much longer. And just, when any of us think of a really stressful day, right? You snap at your kids, you snap at your spouse, you push your dog, right? When you're like up here already from a very stressful day, like you can't tolerate the normal frustrations that you would tolerate, right? That's true for any one of us on a given stressful day, but people with all this toxic stress are up here all the time. So the littlest things set them off, which hopefully to most of us in this room wouldn't. And more difficult with peer relationships, again, because that assumption is that the person's going to hurt me or the person is out to get me or whatever it might be. So to meet their needs, just again, a plug for broader social needs in our country and in our communities. The best way to prevent this on a big level is to meet more of their physiological needs. So that might mean lifting them out of poverty, because poverty is the main stressor in America, right? It's hard for me to talk to a family at West Central about coaching their child through a tantrum when they don't have money to buy dinner and they don't know where they're sleeping that night. And this is every day of my life when I'm serving Medicaid West Central clients. This is in our backyards. We see things on the news, and like my spouse or some of my friends who aren't in mental health or social services, they're like, "Can you believe that?" Like some kids holed up in their house and beat and locked in the closets, and I'm like, that's right down the street. Like, that is our neighborhood. This is happening right there. Right there. Every day. All my clients, well, I'm a trauma therapist, so of course I see them, but the most horrible, horrid stories are happening right in our community. And I can't treat their emotional needs when they don't have a house, when they're living in the homeless shelter, when they don't have money for dinner, when they don't have a car to get themselves to Walmart and it's 0 degrees and they have 5 kids. So the larger social structures are more important than anything I can do on a one-to-one individual level, right? So we need to meet their physiological needs for clothing, food, etc., safety and security, love and belonging. We're going up the hierarchy here. So the idea is that you can't really get to this, hope and healing, until you've got all of these things. Yeah.
Is that the Maslow pyramid?
Yep, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
The original, or is it been modified?
This one has been modified for thinking about bringing services to people. So you see like assistance with rent, experienced case management, peer support, activities, and then individual counseling, hope and healing. All right, so when you're working one-on-one with a person who you either know or you assume has had a lot of these adversities, you can tell because they're already up here all the time, right? Or they're not getting along with anybody, and they're always overwhelmed, and they're late, and you can just see sort of the chronic stress in their lives. There's 2 really good kind of simple interventions in their empathy and regulation. I'll get to it a little bit.
Research is the key reason that cancer is no longer the next sentence.
Skip the ad.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, huh? No. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. I have it, yeah. And we do it all the time, because someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a word, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So this is true for all of us in all of our own relationships, right? When we're sharing something, we just want people to listen. Like, I don't want you to solve my problem, just listen. And so this is true when people are overwhelmed, right? Like, especially, so men have a problem-solving brain, so men often just want to solve your problem for you. But when you're overwhelmed and stressed, that's not what you're looking for. You just want someone to join you in your stress and be empathic. Not fix it, not give you an at least statement, right? Not silver line it, just sit with people and empathize with them, which is way harder than you would expect, because your instinct is always to fix it and to point out something good, but they don't want to hear it. So along with trying to make empathic statements like, I can see how hard this is for you. I can see, you're really struggling. Like, I'll stay here with you, whatever it is. There's a couple other sayings that you can remember. So one is low and slow. Someone's up here and they're really overwhelmed. They're going to absorb your tension or lack of tension. So if you can mindfully bring yourself down, even though you're going to be compelled to come up with them, right? Because we mimic other people. If you can be mindful and keep your voice and your body low and slow when people are under stress or freaking out. So that actually looks like, so let's say you're freaking out. I actually bring my body down to their same level. So I'm not towering over you. So I bring my body low and I bring my voice low. So instead of talking like this, I'm going to bring my voice down and my volume down. And I'm going to slow my words. And I'm going to slow my body movements. Because this is just threat, right? When you move around a lot, it goes right to the brain stem to survive, and they're processing that as threat. Whereas slow movements, submissive movements, getting low, is all your nonverbals are being processed much faster than your verbal. So when you're under stress, you're not thinking, you're not planning, you're not paying good attention, but your nonverbals are picking up on the other person's nonverbals more quickly than words. So your posture is what is being absorbed by that person. Does that make sense? So if someone's really, really elevated and freaking out, our instinct is not to do this. So you have to fight against your instinct, because often we'll want to get big and powerful, right? But then they get bigger and more powerful and more loud. And so you have to fight your instinct to become submissive because your nonverbal cues are like, I don't want to fight, right? I'm not going to fight you. I'm going to stay low. I'm going to be calm. And then hopefully they will absorb your stance, if that makes sense. Are there any thoughts or questions?
What if you are confronting a bully? Is that still the appropriate response? Low and slow?
Probably. Because they're up like, I mean, if they're tense, if they're a chill bully, I don't know. If someone's escalated, this is an intervention for people who are escalated emotionally. So if they're an escalated bully, then yes. If they're like a relaxed bully, I don't know. Maybe not. But, you know, like this whole level thing of power dynamics is an interesting one, right? Because bullies will try to tower over people. And so sometimes if you're in a room and someone's coming on strong, you know, to me, I'll stand up. I'm like, actually, I'm 5'10". I'm going to go ahead and stand up here. Like, how does this feel? Right? I mean, there's a lot of power dynamics going on with height. And I teach, so if a student comes in, and this is true for bosses as well, who's shorter than me, I lower my chair to try not to seem like I'm trying to exert power over them. Or a parent that sits next to me to do a depression screen, I lower my chair so that because it equalizes power. And I'm not trying to, you know, power over them or escalate them. Yeah.
Just had two thoughts. One is to ask you to speak a little bit about strengths-based thinking around trauma, especially for folks who haven't done a lot of background in this, not just focusing on how the brain goes to coping mechanisms that can be unhealthy, but also that some of those neural pathway reroutes can be helpful in other contexts. So that one. And the second one, because we're running out of time, is the concept of trauma-informed practice, which is a discipline that has already been developed and is constantly being kind of improved upon, but that one could adopt in one's business, in one's life, to to not just be thinking about one interaction with one person, but what kind of systems do we need to be different in our own organizations, maybe even our families, to not just account for these kind of real, very real issues that are all around us and that a lot of us in this room probably are dealing with personally, but also in bigger systems. What does it look like to acknowledge that we're all working within systems that traumatize each other and have to deal with that in a real way to get better outcomes? So trauma-informed practice exists, and I just wondered what you had to say about strengths-based.
Yeah. Right, so we could do a day's talk or another hour talk on both of those topics, right, on sort of finding the strengths in people and on trauma-informed care. Our group will actually go into organizations and do needs assessments and draft trauma-informed care plans. We've done it in homeless shelters, in child and family services, child residential treatment centers, so it kind of can take a little bit more depth, but in general, the principles of trauma-informed care are to realize the impact of trauma and the amazing strengths of people who have been under trauma, and to respond in sensitive ways that aren't going to re-traumatize people, right? So this is re-traumatizing, right? So these little ways that I'm talking about, but there's broader things we can do within our organizations that are more sensitive to people with a lot of trauma background, even just like our waiting rooms and how they're structured and where the chairs are and everybody being able to see the door and having welcoming language and nice colors. I've done some consultation in medical settings, especially like OBGYN, right? How can we change that walking in for a pap smear, laying on your back naked? How can we kind of rethink a lot of our practices in our organization to become more trauma-informed as an organization? We look at mission statements. We look at values. We look at, do you promote time off for mental health? Do you promote time off to go get your Suboxone in your recovery? Or do you stigmatize people who are receiving Medicaid-assisted treatment or getting mental health services, right? So those are kind of some ideas of what a trauma-informed organization can do. And the strengths-based is a great point that I wish we had more time to talk about. But all those adaptations to the stressful, traumatic environment were helpful at one point, right? So all of the overreacting to danger or the numbing out was an incredibly smart and sophisticated way that our body uses to get through trauma. It just becomes a problem when we keep using it. We use a metaphor with veterans when I was at the National Center, saying, sometimes the veterans will have trouble reintegrating into civilian life because they've always had their guns up, right? They're always ready for danger and ready to shoot. And so we use an analogy that, that was helpful to you. Like, we honor you. That was awesome. Like, say thank you to yourself. Good job keeping yourself safe and protected. And your body and your brain did what it needed to do, and that's amazing. And now the war is over. Like, we can put our guns down. Like, we can honor what we did, but like literally put the guns down, and also, of course, figuratively putting down all of the defenses that we create for ourselves when we're going through a lot of trauma. Does that make sense? Any questions about those?
There were two items. The first was empathy, and what was the second?
Regulation. I think we'll get there. Go back one, though. I'm going to connect and redirect. I'm going to walk through real quickly, too. So it's kind of the same as what Brene Brown was saying with the empathy, that sometimes our instinct when people are overwhelmed or struggling is to, like, give them space or, like, isolate. So with kids, we'll send them to an isolation room. Luckily, we don't do that very much in public schools, but we still do that in residential centers. She says we do it a lot in schools still. So sometimes our instincts is to disconnect from people because it's too hard to stay with them and help regulate them. But connecting and staying connected is another way to regulate people, because they, again, just as low and slow, they absorb off of our posture and our poise and our experiences. So when you have someone who's overwhelmed and your instincts are saying, like, this person's not going to hurt me. Most people, when they're overwhelmed, don't hurt people. If you can stay connected with them, that is going to help them heal and learn to be regulated much more quickly than isolating them. So we will regulate ourselves and heal with the presence of another person because we're reading off their physiological cues than if we're made to be alone. Does that make sense to people? Like, sure, a kid can, like, kick and scream himself to sleep out of exhaustion, but we don't call that regulation, right? They're not learning anything by screaming themselves to sleep. And I'm trying to think of an example for an adult after they're really dysregulated. They don't really learn a lot by, like, storming off and, like, screeching their tires and, like, swearing and being all by themselves in their dysregulation. They learn a lot more if you can stay with them, and they'll come down a lot faster if you can stay connected with them. All right, we'll get through this. Let's go get a drink of water. I'm here. I'm going to make sure everybody's safe. I'm here. You don't say a lot, but some kind of indication that, like, you have another human being here that's going to get you through this. And I'm going to be calm. You can absorb my calmness if you want. Don't say that. But that's the principle. Does that make sense to people? So people come down a lot faster when they're connected. Now you might also redirect. So connect and redirect. You don't have to, like, wallow in misery together. But, let's go get a drink of water. Let's go take a walk together or something. Let's take a little break together. Let's go get some coffee. Does that make sense to people? Much easier said than done. Okay. So both of those are examples of regulation, right? Like being in the presence of someone, empathizing and connecting is regulating another human being.
Regulating like
Emotion,
mindfully?
yeah,
Okay. Trying to fix that.
yeah, yeah. And when I speak to people who work with children, I add a little bit about regulate over instead of teach, which is true also for your employees. Like, it's not the time to teach, right? When people are overwhelmed, like, you don't want to like remind them of the policies and the rules and like what they can do better next time. It's not the time. Just regulate them. Just modulate their emotions. Just get people calm, because when they're up like this, they don't hear what you're saying anyway. They're not using their prefrontal cortex. Does that make sense to people? We just regulate them. And then later, when they're calm, you might say, hey, you know, by the way, we have to change this. Like, let's problem solve. When they're calm. When they're calm. How long does it usually take the normal person to come down after you've about hit a deer? How long does it take our physiology to come back down?
30 minutes?
Yep, about 30 minutes on average. So you want to wait about 30 minutes before you have that discussion. Or just wait till the next day. Yeah. So different other trauma-sensitive accommodations are to be aware of reminders and triggers for their trauma. Again, like this towering figure is a common one. Loud, chaotic, sirens, police, authority figures of any kind are often triggers. Changes in routines. Do I have some of these listed? Nope. Sometimes if you have a really good relationship with them, you can ask them what escalates them, what reminds them and triggers them. Today, just this morning before I came here, across the street at Rivermill, was the anniversary of my client's mother's overdose death. So that was a big one. Those kind of anniversaries of when people have died and when people have bad things have happened, removed, put into foster care, those kind of anniversaries can be big holidays without family members. Permission to take breaks, right, when people are overwhelmed. Additional support for remembering, organizing either assignments or tasks that you give them because of that executive functioning. Try to be really predictable. It's better to have a caregiver who's mean all the time. Well, I don't know if that's exactly true. Versus unpredictable. Because in our attachment styles, we develop ways to cope with how our caregivers are to us. And if they're the same way all the time, then we can cope the same way all the time. If they're unpredictable, that's the worst kind of attachment style. You have a disorganized way of coping. And leads to a lot of personality diagnoses. Try to give as much choice and control as you can within the workplace, within schools, whatever it is. So I often talk about giving 2 options that are good, that you'd be happy with either one. So for my kids, it's like put on your white socks or your black socks, but you have to put on socks, right? But you're giving them a choice, like which color socks do you want? And then they feel like they're in control, even though you manipulated the situation. But, right, so you're talking to an employee, like, yeah, I want, 2 tasks today. Pick which one you want to do first. You're giving them some choice and control. Support therapy, support service appointments, time off for these appointments, right? Because that's what is going to help their long-term emotional growth and their productivity if they improve their mental health, if they get the substance use treatment, et cetera, et cetera.